Welcome, students, to Lesson 11 of the Changing Economic World topic. In this lesson, we will be finding out about why geography and where countries are located can cause them to be either LICs or HICs. In other words, how geography has created the development gap. Take a moment to write the date, title, and learning objective. Make sure you have a pen and paper ready. Let's go. Time to recall your learning. Let's see how much you understand and remember from previous lessons. Please write 1 to 10. Attempt the questions, pause the video, and then check your answers. Game time. Go. Okay, number 1. HICs use tariffs, which are a tax on imports, to make imports from LICs more expensive. These are examples of trade barriers. What stage of the DTM has the highest rate of natural increase? You should have put stage 2. 3. Natural increase happens when birth rate is higher than the death rate, so the population grows. 4. In any years, many people are moving from rural areas to urban areas in search of better paid jobs and education. 5. The hot and dry climate of Mali in Africa means agriculture is difficult and there are low crop yields. 6. The export of primary products and import of manufactured products leads to a trade deficit, where the value of a country's imports is more than its exports. 7. Colonialism is the process in which stronger countries take control of weaker ones by force. 8. War can prevent development by damaging vital infrastructure, for example, roads, houses, and schools. 9. What does DTM stand for? It stands for the Demographic Transition Model. And 10. The HDI is better than any single measure of development because it also shows how healthy and educated people are, which tells us their quality of life, not just their standard of living like GDP per capita. Please give yourselves a mark out of 12 because 3 and 4 were worth 2. If you missed any or you got below 8, come back to this lesson in a week and reattempt this quiz. Let's tap into your prior knowledge to see how much you already know about this topic and get you thinking about today's lesson. This is a photo of a mine in a country called Chile in South America. Mining is a really important part of Chile's economy. So, I want you to try and answer these 4 questions from memory to see how much you understand of this already. Go for it. So question 1, describe what you see in the photo. You should have said that this photo shows the primary sector, in particular mining. It also shows machines digging for these resources underground. 2, what sector is this in? This is in primary sector, as I said previously. 3, how can having natural resources help a country develop? Well, you should have put that natural resources such as copper or gold or diamonds or silver or anything found under the ground like oil can help a country develop because either they can be exported, which provides income for a country, or they can be processed into manufactured products and therefore used or exported for more. For example, copper may be manufactured into wires and then sold for more than it would be just as copper. 4. What problems could natural resources cause for a country? This is definitely the hardest question, but you may have thought about the following possibilities. Number 1, this might cause environmental damage. The ground is being dug up, which could damage biodiversity, the plants and the trees and the animals, their habitats being destroyed. It could also cause air pollution, as these machines release harmful chemicals into the air or into the water. Or if it's coal or oil, it could cause air pollution because when you burn these things to produce energy, it releases harmful chemicals into the atmosphere. Also releases carbon dioxide, which leads to global warming. You could also have said, at a much more advanced level, you could have said how the money created by natural resources could be stolen by some people, for example, politicians in government, which could make them very rich, but not benefit the other people in the country, thereby leading to inequality. If you said that, that's excellent. So, today we're going to understand 2 key questions. How can where you are in the world affect your development, and how can what you have under the ground affect your development? So, number 1. Here we go, big question. Being landlocked versus being coastal. How can that affect a country's development? Right, this is a subtitle. Let me explain. This is Africa. There are 54 countries in Africa. These green countries are said to be landlocked countries. They have, you will notice, no border with the sea. This means they have no access to ports. They cannot build ports, which means that trade is much more difficult. They will find it more difficult to import goods from around the world, and they will find it more difficult to export goods from around the world because they don't have access to ports. As a result of being landlocked, therefore, they struggle to trade, these countries. Second reason why being landlocked is a problem, especially in a continent like Africa. These landlocked countries are often surrounded by uncooperative, violent, dangerous or hostile neighbours that don't necessarily want to help these countries, or they can't help them. This often leads to a situation like this. This photo was taken in Zambia, here. And products made in Zambia are trying to get to the coastline, here in Mozambique, to be able to be exported around the world. However, at the border, the government of Mozambique are charging the Zambian truckers here a duty, which is a type of trade barrier, to be able to travel through Mozambique. A duty is an extra cost that the drivers have to pay to be able to continue driving through Mozambique. This means that the businesses that sell the products, the Zambian businesses, they do not make as much profit because they're paying more money to be able to transport the products through their neighbour. So one reason why being landlocked is a problem is that countries often have to pass through other countries and pay when they pass through. The second reason is that if a landlocked country is surrounded by a country that has a civil war going on, or famine, which means no food, or it has bad infrastructure, that makes transporting goods through that country dangerous or difficult, which again means it is less able to export its goods around the world. So as a result of not having ports and having bad neighbours, landlocked countries find it more difficult to trade than coastal countries, and therefore often least developed. These countries in Africa are some of the least developed in Africa. However, not all of them are as undeveloped as others. For example, Botswana is one of the most developed and Ethiopia is more developed. Botswana is more developed because its neighbour is South Africa, which is actually a good neighbour and doesn't charge it duties to be able to export its goods. Botswana also exports diamonds which can easily be transported by aeroplane, and aeroplanes don't have to worry about transporting goods through other countries. However, overall, being landlocked, especially landlocked with bad neighbours, is a disadvantage for the reasons that I have explained. On average, landlocked countries around the world are 30% poorer than coastal countries. The GDP per capita is 30% less on average. Very important fact. Second, geographical cause of the development gap are access to natural resources. Natural resources are natural materials that have a value to people. So for example, gold or diamonds or oil or fish or anything under the ground that might have a value. For example, copper. Some countries have more natural resources than others, and that leads to a development gap. Let me show you. This is Chile, an HIC in South America. And one of the things that makes Chile very rich is its very large reserves, which means supplies underground of a metal called copper. They dig the copper up and they refine it and process it into pure copper cables, which they export for an incredibly high value. As such, Chile makes a lot of revenue from exporting copper. It uses this revenue to spend and invest in development projects. It also uses it to attract more companies because it can pay for factories, for example, and for training its people. As a result of natural resources like copper, Chile is an HIC. because it has lots of money from trade that it can make very easily from exporting natural resources. However, having natural resources can also work the other way. This is Equatorial Guinea, a country that we've met before in Africa. Equatorial Guinea makes most of its money from exporting oil and natural gas. It sets up these oil rigs in the sea and drills underground underneath the rock in the seabed for oil and natural gas. Oil comes from the bodies of fish being compressed and crushed over time over millions of years underground, which over time turns into oil. The oil is then extracted and transported to a refinery where it is turned into things like petrol, which is used in cars, or jet fuel, which is used in planes. Oil makes an enormous amount of money for Equatorial Guinea. However, Equatorial Guinea is overall an incredibly poor country, and here's why. Normally, a country with few natural resources, the government makes most of its money from taxes. The government takes some of the income of every person that works in a country, and that's how it makes its money. However, in a country with many natural resources, a government may not need to get its money from taxes because it gets its money from selling the oil and the gas, for example. Why is this important? Because if a government does not need taxes from its people because it's making its money from exporting natural resources, then a government doesn't need to care about its people. Why? Because taxes increase when people are more educated and healthier. When people make more money, they pay more tax. And in order for people to make more money, they need better jobs. And better jobs come to people who are healthy and educated. And health and education comes from the government investing in schools and hospitals, doctors, teachers. And the government gets its money from the tax that way. Now, if a government doesn't need taxes because it gets its money from exporting natural resources, then it doesn't need to invest in schools and hospitals. And as a result, the people's quality of life decreases and they do not develop. This is a typical scene in Equatorial Guinea. Very rich palace of the government and very poor people. In Equatorial Guinea, they discovered oil very early on in their creation as a country. The government took complete control over the extraction of oil and gas, and it stole all of the money from the oil and gas when it was sold, and it put it into bank accounts, and very few people in the government benefited from it. So you have a situation in which a few hundred people in Equatorial Guinea are extremely rich in the government, but most of the people in the country who are not part of this arrangement are very poor, because the government does not need to invest in education, healthcare and infrastructure because it doesn't collect taxes. The people are therefore not skilled and can't get good jobs. So what decides whether natural resources benefit a country or harm it? It turns out the key thing that decides whether a country benefits or loses out from natural resources is what happens in the country before that country discovers the natural resource. Before Chile discovers copper underground, or before Equatorial Guinea discovers oil underground. Here are the key things that decide whether natural resources are good or bad. The first one is the government. If the government in a country and the leader of the government in a country has complete power and can do what they want, at the time that they discover the natural resources will end up being like this. Because the leader of that country will say, right, I'm going to take all the wealth from the natural resources and put it in my own pocket and become incredibly rich. And I will give some of the money to the people who help me. But I will not give any to the people. If, however, there is a limit to the amount of power that the government has in a country when they discover natural resources, if there are rules saying the government can't do what it wants, then a country ends up like this. The government ends up investing in the people and in what they need to develop. Certain things matter. For example, if a country has good courts which means that people who are guilty of a crime go to prison and people who are innocent do not, then the country ends up becoming like Chile. Because people who steal money from natural resources go to prison, and people in government are forced to share the wealth from natural resources with the people because of the courts. So good judges are really important. A country must have this before it discovers natural resources, which means that the government must have invested in the education of judges and lawyers before discovering natural resources. Only then will natural resources benefit that country. Secondly, before natural resources are discovered, the country must have a good healthcare system, which means that people are healthy and able to work. And as a result of being healthy, they are more likely to be educated. So the government must invest in education and in healthcare. If people are healthy and educated, they will be able to access good jobs. And so they will not all be working in extracting natural resources or in manufacturing. They will have high-paid jobs in other sectors. And so they will not depend on natural resources for money. Not only that, but educated and healthy people expect the government to behave better, and they have more power to make sure the government behaves better. For example, they can write in newspapers criticizing the government, or they can choose to vote in elections and therefore choose their governments. If a country has a system where people choose their governments, that's called a democracy. And this works best when people are healthy and educated. So if a country has healthy and educated people, and it has a government that cares about its people but has limited power, and it has good courts, if it has all of these things before it discovers natural resources, then the natural resources will help the country develop. If it doesn't have these things, then the country will likely not develop, because a few people will become incredibly rich and most will be poor. So natural resources can go either way, depending on what the country has before it discovers them. Let's check your understanding. Question 1. What is a natural resource? And give me 2 examples. You should have said a natural resource is a naturally found material that has a value to people. For example, copper, oil, gold, coal, or diamonds, or silver, or mercury, or tin. Any of these things are natural resources. Question 2. Why has Equatorial Guinea not benefited from natural resources? Give me as many reasons as you can think of. You should have put, Equatorial Guinea has not benefited from natural resources because the government has stolen all the money from the natural resources by taking control of its extraction. This means that the people had no say in what happened to the money. Equatorial Guinea its government does not need to collect taxes because it gets all of its money from selling oil. Also, Equatorial Guinea had not invested in healthcare, education, and a good and fair government before it found its natural resources. So when it found its natural resources, the government had unlimited power and the people were uneducated, and so the government could take whatever money from the natural resources that it wanted. Question 3. What does it mean to be a landlocked country? If a country is landlocked, it has no borders with the sea. Give me 2 reasons why a landlocked country in a continent like Africa struggles to develop. Reason number 1, a landlocked country, for example, in the continent of Africa struggles to develop because it has no access to ports and so it is physically more difficult to trade. Reason number 2, landlocked countries in Africa often have bad neighbours who either charge them to be able to transport goods through them, or there is a war going on, or there's bad infrastructure, so it's difficult or dangerous to transport goods. Final question. Give me 2 geographical reasons for the development gap. You should have said landlocked versus coastal countries. Landlocked countries usually less developed than coastal countries. And reason number 2 is natural resources. Okay, please attempt this question from memory, use the keywords, and then mark your answer. Go for it. Write the question as a title. Okay, let's look at a possible answer that you should have included. So why can they both help and hinder development? So your first paragraph should have been how they help development. Natural resources can be exported for income, a mark. This can be spent on development projects like education, healthcare and infrastructure, a mark. Natural resources can also be used in manufacturing. For example, copper can be processed into wires and exported for greater profit. However, you could have said that abundant natural resources, which means having a lot of natural resources, can make a country dependent on them, which means they need them to be able to survive. They need them for money. If a country exports lots of natural resources, for example, copper or oil, it might not invest in other industries like manufacturing or the tertiary sector because it has no need to make money. This would mean that if the price of the resource decreases, then the country has less income for development. For example, Equatorial Guinea. If the price of oil goes down around the world, then Equatorial Guinea every year will make much less money if the price goes down, because the only thing it really exports is oil. So being dependent on a natural resource is dangerous because if the price of that resource goes down, you lose the money. Whereas if a country has lots of different sources of income, then they will not be affected if the price of that one product goes down. Natural resources can also lead to corruption. Corruption means when people in power abuse their power for their own gains. For example, stealing money from natural resource exports. Governments can make deals with companies to extract and export the resources and then take all the profits. This means the people do not benefit from the profits and so the country does not develop. This also creates high inequality as a few people become rich but most remain poor. Give yourselves a mark out of 6 for this based on the 6 points that you have. Try and underline these words in your answers and add whatever you don't have. This is a challenging topic, so I strongly recommend that you watch the explanation again and attempt this answer again. I would also suggest you go onto YouTube and other sources and research this question further. Okay, in your books, 2 questions about this lesson from memory. Write the answers and then test yourselves on them in a week. Thank you so much for joining me for this section on the causes of the development gap. Next, we will be looking at how we can solve the development gap, how we can reduce the gap in development between HICs and LICs, so that you realize there is hope.